Okay, I think we'll get started, everyone. It's 7 o'clock. Let's get started on time. Welcome everyone here this evening. I think Ethan White is an apology, Councillor White. Councillor Hughes is an apology. And everyone else is here. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we meet on tonight is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. I'd like to welcome members of, well, I'd like to welcome staff, because it's really just staff and invited guests here this evening. If there's anyone listening, I can't see where is the live stream on? How do I know that? How do I know? I can't see anything. Is it on? It's on, okay. Right, but I didn't know that, no one told me. Okay. Firstly, I'd like to welcome council members, anybody listening on live stream this evening, council staff. It's also, I'd like to acknowledge Neil McFarlane and Catherine Ward. Is that you two down the end there? Hello. Are you Neil and are you Catherine? Right, sure. And also David Hitchcock, the Executive Officer of GFRMA. And so Neil and Catherine are from the South Australian Department of Environment and Water. This session has been convened for the purpose of briefing council members about the Gawler River Flood Mitigation Business Case Project. Tonight's presentation will provide refreshed information about the objectives, costs and benefits for potential flood mitigation options, which are important for protecting our town, but it's also about the region as well. This session will be used solely for the purpose of information sharing and not for the purpose of debating issues, building consensus positions or otherwise discharging council's deliberative and decision-making functions, which sits with a council meeting or special meeting or committee meeting. There's no set agenda, no minutes will be taken during this session. To limit disruption of the session, I'd really ask people to just turn their mobile phones to silent, please. If you do need to take a phone call, please take it outside. Oh, you're here? Oh, right. Okay, so Councillor White is not an apology. Okay, so if people could turn their phones to silent. If you do need to take a phone call, please take it outside, because it is quite disruptive when you're talking on a phone in the middle of a session. So, and if I'm sure none of you will do that. I'm sure you will all go outside and take your phone call. There's no requirement that I've been advised of going into confidence, so that won't be an issue this evening. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Neil and Catherine. If you'd like to go up to the podium and I'll turn the mic on. If you'd just like to press that button.
There we go.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, it's just this button. Thanks. Thank you very much, and real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the council, and thank you, Mayor, for that kind welcome. My name is Neil McFarlane. I'm the Director of Climate Change and Hazard Risks at the Department of Environment and Water. So I look after climate change policy and also what are the clear hazards for the state, and included in that is, of course, flood management, which we're the flood hazard leader for the state as well. So we're very well across river catchments, including here in the Gawler. So I'll just go through very quickly. I'm just going to give a bit of context for 1 minute or so, and then going to hand over to my colleague, Catherine Ward, who's going to go through the more detailed business case where you'll really hit the real issues that we're trying to go through today. So very quickly, what the problem is, as you know, during rainfall events, the flood waters often breach the banks of the Gawler, North Power and South Power rivers and can cause damage to crops. And the other problem we've experienced is that the responsibility for floodplain management is quite difficult because we have landscape boards, we have different councils, we have the state role, so it often gets fragmented, and often that doesn't help in the planning. And also the pace of change at the moment in this flood area, floodplain, is dramatically changing quite quickly with new developments, as you're very well aware. The previous government put some money towards investing in the Gawler River, recognising that there are some issues that need to be resolved, and they put some money towards 4 key projects. One was the Hillier Fireground rehabilitation of the river, pulling out some of the trees there to clear it up. That's been done. Camilla and Park Roads further downstream is another project which is at the very early stages because there was some small delays because of the complications of that project, but it's going well now. And then we have the improved flood forecasting and warning systems, putting new warning systems out there, and we worked very hard with all the councils to get that project up and going, and it's almost finished now, probably another few months, and then we'll finish the last of the gauges. And then the survey, levee repair and vegetation management, pulling weeds out in particular downstream. So that's half of the kind of big project we did. And the other half is the business case, which I think is the most important one for the long-term solution for flood management. And I think now, before I pass on to Kevin, just acknowledge that we are accounting for climate change. We're looking at the very high emission scenarios based on the IPCC International Panel on Climate Change about their highest scenarios. And when we are looking at some of the modelling, we do that. And we just wanted to be very clear that when we do our modelling that we have looked at the kind of conservative end of the higher ends of climate change. And you can see the water level increases as we head downstream on those higher scenarios. So I'm going to throw over to Catherine now to quickly go through the business case.
So early last year, when we started engaging with stakeholders, including yourself and other councils, to couple, I guess, the story with what's the problem, we wanted to talk about what the objectives and benefits we wanted to see into the future. So what were our objectives in managing flood? And we worked with a group of government and non-government stakeholders to come up with this, what is called investment logic by Treasury and Finance. And the idea is you define your problem and you define where you want to go. So the objectives in our space, in this region for flood management, was primarily stakeholders want to see a change in the physical flooding characteristics. But alongside that, equally important is that we deliver solutions for which flooding consequences are acceptable for all users of the river. And the term users is quite broad. So people who might take water for irrigation, who might have a cultural or social connection to the river, who might own property where the river runs through. So the list is quite broad. And I think you would appreciate that the diversity of people in the region is quite large as well. So different perspectives on how to use the river. Delivering integrated solutions that achieve multiple water management outcomes is also really important. So we're not just looking to solve flood for the sake of flood, but we acknowledge that the river is a natural environment and that the environment does actually need flooding from time to time to benefit. So how do we balance that, that changing the physical flooding characteristics without, I guess, disbenefiting the environment? But there's also opportunities for us to look at how we might harvest water during times of flood when there's plenty of water. How could we store that? How could we reuse it later? And then coupled alongside all of that was increasing the awareness of flood risk and the preparedness that individuals and businesses and industry and government can all take in anticipation of the next flood event. And as I go through, you'll see why that is so important. But those were the 4 key objectives, and they all come with a commensurate benefit So with that in mind, in 2022, we looked at a really long list of flood management options and we compared that against the investment logic. So there was in excess or around about 20 different options we looked at. They involved hard infrastructure, so building dams and levees, alongside non-infrastructure options like planning controls. And we shortlisted those options that met that investment logic and started to sort of interrogate which ones were probably more preferential as compared to others. A couple of things stood out for us, one of which was, and you may have heard of this option before, the northern floodway concept, as it was previously conceptualised, didn't really work as a standalone option. But we did see merit in exploring it as part of a suite of initiatives, infrastructure initiatives. So we wanted to explore that a little bit further in combination with other things. We also found that because of the scale and size of the flood problem in this region, that solely relying on a non-infrastructure option like flood awareness and preparedness campaign would probably not be sufficient to make a huge impact. So as a standalone option, that probably wasn't the best way to go. Again, probably really good in combination with other things. The two options that kind of stood out for further investigation in a lot more detail were levees and an expansion to the North Para Flood Control Dam, otherwise known as the Bruce Eastick Dam. The levees did require us to do a little bit more definition around what we meant by levees. So levees can be, in this case, they were explored as levees around townships. So around the existing township of Gawler, around the township of Two Wells and through Anglevale. There are also levees that already exist along the length of the river between around about Port Wakefield Road and Baker Road, a little bit upstream of there. And there are levees that would make up the northern floodway into the future if that was an option that went ahead. So one of the things we found from this was that we needed to better define levees. We also needed to better explore the Bruce Eastick Dam expansion in terms of different heights. And we've done that in the last 12 months. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my clicker.
So there are people in our community that don't have any faith in levies. They've failed in the past, and I'm talking about people who live in Hillier, and they've failed spectacularly. I think we need to be very cautious when we talk about levies, because there are people who have had them fail and the water just goes straight through them.
Yeah, I have actually visited a couple of properties in the Hillier area and seen some of the spectacular levee failures, so I can absolutely understand that. I will also say that levees are quite often a flood mitigation tool that is prone to failure, so they're probably the lesser reliable ones. But they do offer, particularly in a system like this, that is a perched river, where the river sits higher than the floodplain, they do offer a level of protection in terms of giving greater channel capacity. So we did, as part of our short-term projects that Neil introduced, the river survey. We went along and we looked at levee banks on private properties, and we did a condition assessment of them. What we found is that a lot of the levees along the length of the river, and we did look at levees as high upstream as Hillier and all the way down to Port Wakefield Road, a lot of them are non-engineered and they're in pretty poor condition and aren't well maintained. And that's a big part of why they fail. So into the future, we highly recommend that there be a program of upgrading existing levee banks, and that there be a management program put in place with local government to make sure that they're maintained, and that we're not reliant on all of the individual property owners, private property owners, doing their little bit, because at the moment we can sort of see that that's leading to a bit of a mishmash of quality out there.
Councillor Koch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Just while we're talking about levies, I suppose the next question is the cost and who will be responsible for maintaining them. I mean,
if they're on private land.
I mean, later on it does talk in the costings, but do you want to comment it now or later?
I can comment about it now, for sure. So at the moment, as part of our short-term project, we're piloting an approach to how we might access and maintain them. Being that they are a lot on private property, we are approaching private property owners and talking to them about the potential to implement easements. The idea being that if we come in now and do improvement works to them, the state government can fund that through some existing project funds. Not all of them, but we have a funds available at the moment to do a few pilots. And then we could look to put those improved levies into easements, and the proposal at this stage is that we trial having councils do ongoing maintenance for those levies.
Yes, Councillor Koch.
Yeah, I mean, that figure's $152,000 per annum to maintain the levies. So is there an expectation that all the councils contribute that $152,000?
I have no answer to that because we haven't talked about that yet. Yeah, and look, I think that's something for the GRFMA councils to honestly sit down and talk about, and that will come next in the sort of next steps for the business case. You know, how do we deliver this? What does a funding model look like? We don't have that solved right now. This is more the technical aspects of the...
With stormwater management, we're talking about stormwater management, and is the state government agreeable or interested in contributing? Because it really shouldn't just be up to local government. This is a regional problem that goes across 6 councils, and it should be a state and federal issue. And, you know, how do we leverage that? Because it should not be just up to local government, because we've only got finite amounts of funds, and really small councils like Gawler, you know, bigger councils like Playford, they still haven't maintained their levies. Lots of those levies are on private land, so it is tricky. I appreciate that there could be potential for easements. However, it should not be up to just local government, because that's passing the buck.
So we acknowledge in terms of managing floods that it's a shared responsibility between all levels of government, so federal, state and local government. And alongside that, you know, shared responsibility would be an obligation for shared funding. What the split amongst those 3 tiers of government looks like, I don't know, and that's something for us all to talk about. I can say that the last round of Australian government funding for disaster ready funding, which is the current program that the Australian government's running for things like flood management, is run off a 50-50 basis. So 50% is the maximum from the Australian government and 50% co-contribution from other participants in the project. So that's kind of a model that we can start to think about when it comes to a maximum from the Australian government. And then in terms of state government, there is an expectation from state government that local government contributes something, but what that something looks like is definitely up for discussion and in the coming months, if not years. So turning to the options we've explored on a technical basis at this point in time. These were the 8 options and option combinations that we've explored in detail for the business case. The North Para flood control dam expansion by 10 metres, additional 10 metre height on the dam wall. The Northern Floodway township levies has now been defined very specifically as township levies around the township of Gawler. The reason we have defined it like that is because the township of Two Wells has a current levy bank project that is funded by the Australian government and is going ahead at the moment. So we don't need to build that into the business case. We'll assume it's there in the future. And then some developments through the City of Playford area like Riverlea and through Anglevale have levy banks going in as part of their developments. So we don't need to build that into the business case either. The flood awareness campaign we have included in there as a standalone option, not because we believe it's viable standalone, but so that we could explore it in a bit more detail. You may recall earlier this year, you may have seen some advertising through social media. We did a community survey on flood awareness and preparedness. With the assistance of your council, we got the message out about that survey. We had a reasonably good response to that again this year. It was the second time we've run it. And this year we had some additional questions in there that helped us to shape, I guess, a value proposition for flood awareness. And that gave us a bit more information for the business case. The following options up there on the slide are all combinations of different infrastructure and non-infrastructure options.
I might just go to Councillor Koch. He has another question.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, Catherine, you talked about harvesting water from the river at peak times. Can you just confirm to everybody that it's going to be a mitigation dam, not a retention dam, with the raising of the dam and the scenario around the harvesting of water?
Yeah, absolutely. So the option to expand the North Para Flood Control Dam, so the Bruce Eastick Dam, doesn't change the flood control dam's function. So it is a retention dam. It just holds water back for a period of time and releases it slowly downstream. It has a low flow pipe at river invert, so at the riverbed, and two higher flow pipes halfway up the dam wall and then a spillway. The idea there is that you basically flatten out the hydrograph flow over time. The expansion won't change the way that functions. If we were to harvest water, we would only be able to harvest water when there's water behind the flood control dam, so when it's wet, basically. And the idea is that you would pump it from the river behind the dam, pump it to an off-stream storage and use it for later. So there'll be some years where you can pump a lot, some years where you can pump nothing. On average, though, it does... It's certainly, on an average annual, it's worth exploring. So we have done a hydrological investigation and assessed it on an average annual basis, and it could make economic sense for potentially when we're talking to the Concordia development group at the moment in planning, it's potentially an option for that area.
What about environmental flows for the river?
So
we've enjoyed some really good environmental flows, and it's been good to see water in the river. And what you're talking about is there won't be water in the river.
No, there will always be water in the river. So the North Para River is part of a prescribed water area. So any harvesting of water would only happen above a threshold flow. So there'll always be a base flow for the environment, and we would only be able to harvest above that minimum. So you need to have enough water above the minimum to be able to extract. So we would need to talk to the Barossa Water Allocation Planning people in Northern and York Landscape Board and in water licensing in order to harvest water. And there would absolutely be water for the environment still there.
What if there wasn't? What if there wasn't? We're going into drought. If
there's no water available, we can't harvest water. So you would be able to harvest zero in some years. And it's about 20% of years. We looked at a 50-year assessment period, and there are about 18 to 20 of those 50 years. 18 out of 50, I think, so it's a little bit more than 20%. Doing maths in my head. That you couldn't harvest any water at all.
So we're mostly in drought. We very rarely have wet years. We've enjoyed some wet years in recent times, but we will be going into drought. And yeah, I'm just concerned that if Concordia takes water, that there's not enough for environmental flows.
There just isn't a situation where we'd be allowed to do that. So prescription mandates that there will always be a base environmental flow. The risk here is that we proceed with an option that includes the ability, so the infrastructure to harvest water, a pump, a rising main, a bigger storage offline, and we're just in drought for a lot of years and we can't use that infrastructure, and basically it's just mothballed infrastructure. So there is definitely a risk there. And I will say that the assessment we have done is based on 50 years of actual record from the 1970s to 2020. And there's a risk there that the climate is changing. While we've factored climate change into our assessments, there's still a risk that our projections weren't, spot on to what's actually going to happen. I would say that a water harvesting option we have only looked at very conceptually and does require a bit more exploration if people are genuinely interested in it, including the fact that we have only assessed it up to a point of storage, not to a point of customer. So we haven't gone to the point of identifying who potential customers might be yet. So that's another piece of work that might still need to happen. The option to include water harvesting can be added to any of the dam options that you see on the screen here for an additional cost, which I'll get to in a minute. So it's kind of what we're calling a bit of an additional optional extra. It's not part of the base flood mitigation options. It's worth noting that for each of the infrastructure options you see on the screen, including the Bruce Eastick Dam raise and the Northern Floodway, we do have to upgrade the existing river levees upstream of Port Wakefield Road to just upstream of Baker Road. And that is because, a bit like you were saying earlier, Mayor, that the levees fail and they cause problems, right? So we want to
Some people put holes in the levees to allow water to go into their properties.
Yes.
We know that happens.
We know that happens, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I've visited properties where I've seen that happen too. So, and that's where having one authority or a government authority overseeing the management means that that kind of stuff can't be happening. So we would like to do a program of upgrading all those existing levees so that if a dam were to be built, we have confidence in how those levees downstream are going to behave. So we've done all these technical investigations with the assistance of your council and the other councils in the GRFMA, basically to get to the point where we are doing a cost-benefit assessment. So we want a realistic cost estimate of what we're now having.
Can you go through your explanation of flood awareness campaign? Or is that a future slide?
So the flood awareness campaign would be around educating our community around flood risk and what they can do to prepare themselves, a bit like bushfire preparedness. Yeah. So you know how every bushfire season we see a good campaign around the different bushfire ratings and what people can do to prepare their homes for bushfire. We don't have a similar program for flood anywhere in the state, but we're working with the state emergency service and they would very much like to implement something like that. And with the surveys we've done in Gawler, we know that less than half of the respondents across 5 council areas believe that there's any flood risk at all. And
we've got the highest risk in the state.
Yes. So this is a problem, right? So people don't know they're at risk unless maybe we tell them. So that's what that campaign would do.
I think that reflects the transient nature of some people who move in and out, and some people only stay in this area for about 5 years, and then you get a whole group of new people that come in, and they're unaware of their flood risk, and I think that might reflect what you've just said.
We certainly had a lot of respondents to the last survey who've never experienced a flood in this region, so they're completely unaware of what could happen.
Councillor Koch, just another question, if that's okay.
Just with the awareness program, would that include diversification of land holdings, so people can mitigate their risk by having their business located in different locations, some areas close to the river, some areas away from the river, just to diversify their risk? Is that part of the awareness program?
It could be. So if we're providing information to landholders to make informed decisions, they could certainly be making those kinds of informed decisions. I know when we've gone out and visited properties, principally around the levee bank project, we have had some landholders ask us, can we get detailed flood mapping for our property? Can you give that to us so I can plan where to build my next greenhouse? Well, yes, we've done flood modelling. I can't tell you where to build your next greenhouse, but I can certainly give you some information to help your decision making. So that's really what the flood awareness campaign would be about.
Thank you.
Now, I'm sorry, my clicker's stopped working. Can someone go to the next slide? Thank you. So this just gives you a picture of where the township levies would be around Gawler. It's worth pointing out that what we have done in our investigations is look at where we can put them technically and functionally in terms of the land space that would be required. They're all located on public land, and I guess the challenge with these, and you'll see it later in the cost benefit assessment, is that, as you can see on the image, there's gaps between them. They're not continuous, and they only function to a certain height. So this is just the red lines are to give you an idea of where they would go around the township, and obviously the blue lines there are the north-south para joining together to join the Gawler River. And get the next slide. So this gives you an idea of planning controls. What we did in terms of modelling planning controls, because we needed to model, I guess, planning alongside some of the structural infrastructure that we can put into the floodplain, is we took the 1 in 200 year, or the 0.5% AEP flood inundation map, and we looked at what happens for areas prone to inundation greater than 30 centimetres and what happens to areas prone to inundation less than 30 centimetres, and put different levels of control on them. So if an area is prone to more than 30 centimetres of inundation, we really don't want things like public institutions, hospitals, schools, aged care to be in those locations because they're very risky and hard to evacuate in the event of an emergency.
Well, we've had that. We've had that.
Learning from our experience. Let's
Yes.
not put them there again. And we probably want to restrict and put strong restrictions on new residential development. Now, that's not to say they can't go there, but they certainly need to engineer ways to protect those that property and lives in those property.
Hillier Park didn't have any effective evacuation procedures. They now have. They now have implemented those, which is really quite encouraging. But I think it was staff that had to remove 95-year-old people, and they went without their medications, and they were put in our recreation centre, and we didn't have appropriate chairs, appropriate facilities to house so many people, and it was quite tricky at times. Yeah, and we did feed that back through Housing SA because they were the lead agency. Well, it made it very difficult because they were there till 7 or 8 at night, and some of them never had their medications, and the Housing SA people did not know how they had to get how you would access medications, which really is quite a basic need for older people, because they just left without their medications, and some of them were diabetics, some of them had heart conditions, etc., and they were without all of their medications. So yeah, it was quite tricky, but then they were allowed to go home late into the evening. Yeah, but it just shows you that working with older people, we were not prepared. And I don't think anybody is prepared, because you need specialised equipment for older people, and they did not bring a lot of equipment with them. So it is a challenge at times.
So certainly in terms of planning, the public institutions are probably the ones you want to restrict the strongest. And then you sort of move down that vulnerability curve. So where people are, so residences, where you've got intensive animal production, and then broadacre cropping is, I guess, you're least vulnerable. So that's kind of how we've modelled it. And then in terms of planning controls, this gives you a general idea of the floodplain. The red is potential new development areas that would be affected by planning controls, and where we started to see in our modelling that we would restrict development. And you can, unfortunately, I haven't zoomed in on the township of Gawler, but there are some red areas around the fringes of the township of Gawler as well. There's also what's probably not on this map is infill development. So how you think about when you infill in existing developed areas, what you can infill with so that you're not putting another aged care home into a flood-prone area. So this is really the crux of the whole business case, and this is the cost-benefit analysis. So what you see on the screen is each of the options that I presented earlier on one of the slides. Option 1 is the Bruce Eastick Dam raise for 10 metre raise, and option 1A is the same thing but with that water security option we talked about. Water security can be added to any of the dam options, and we've only just presented it as that option 1A on this slide just for simplicity. All of the costs and benefits are in present value, and the benefit cost ratio is really what you want to look at there in bold. So the two options and their combinations, because there is no one solution here, but the combinations that have the best benefit cost ratio are a dam raise combined with planning controls, and a dam raise combined with an awareness campaign and planning controls. So a real good mix of infrastructure and non-infrastructure. And the reason for that is that no matter what infrastructure we build, there will always be some residual flood risk in this region. This river is perched, it's designed by nature to flood. So we need to live with a level of flooding and how we manage that, particularly in terms of the community's awareness, preparedness and resilience, comes down to some of those non-infrastructure options. So raising the community's awareness will deal with some of that residual risk. I will point out also that all infrastructure options have an environmental impact, and we do need to weigh that up against the benefit that they provide. The dam raise has less environmental impact than something like a floodway, and that's because the floodway redirects flow into other areas, so away from the Buckland Park Lake, for example. All options assume some complementary catchment management is happening upstream, so stormwater management in our townships, catchment management and land management in our agricultural zones, so that we have a good condition in our waterways. I said earlier our planning controls assume that 0.5% or 1 in 200 year event. This slide, while the earlier slide pointed out that there are benefits and costs in monetary terms, this slide, while very busy, the intent of it is to point out that there are some additional benefits that, while we can try and monetise them, our confidence level in that monetary value is not as good. So we put them what we call below the line, and they're there in that grey-black colour. A really interesting and important one is the value that an awareness campaign would bring to some of those indirect social costs that we see through society after big disasters. So communities that are more aware and more prepared are more resilient to natural disasters. We've seen this in the eastern states recently and through our River Murray experience. And so a community that is resilient is going to have fewer costs associated to mental health and family violence and alcohol abuse. Now, these are not necessarily all directly related to natural disasters, but our economists have estimated that around about $330 million over the next 30 years could be avoided if we have a flood-aware community in this region. So that's not an insignificant number. So there's a really good value to the flood awareness campaign there. The other thing that's not in the benefit cost ratio is the ability to, I guess, have a land value uplift. So if a piece of land was previously flood prone and our mitigation strategies make it less flood prone, does it go up in capital value? Has it got more potential to be developed for other things? That again is not direct one-for-one relationship to flood mitigation, so we've done an estimate there, but it does sit outside of the benefit cost ratio in terms of what Department of Treasury and Finance look at. Can I get the next slide? Thank you. So in terms of building, I guess, what is the option combination that has the best benefit cost ratio? So the direct costs associated with a dam are going to cost in the order of $200 million. So it's quite substantial. Yeah. And I will point out that that is the most recent cost estimate that I got in the last couple of weeks. So if some in the room have seen the estimates before, they are slightly different. And there are other costs associated with delivering the package. So upgrading the existing levies costs in the order of $30 million. an awareness campaign would cost in the order of just over $700,000 per annum, because you need to repeat that every year. Planning, we have assumed there's no additional cost on what is already in place for planning. However, if a specific code amendment was required to make these changes, there would be some administrative fees for that. So that's something to keep in mind. Alongside all of this is an allowance of around about $1 million for environmental works and cultural heritage. So there are some cultural heritage sites that we would need to protect and work with the traditional owners around.
Councillor Koch.
Now, Catherine, I think David might be able to answer this one. What was the cost breakup between federal, state and local when we built the Bruce Eastick Dam? Because that might give us an indication of maybe how that can be broken up.
Yeah, fundamentally the contributions for GRFMA council's pay was about 22% and the state was 30 something, I think, and then the rest was the federal. I've got some figures actually in my system, but I haven't got them with me at the moment. But
I suppose the point I'm making is that a majority of this would potentially come from the federal government, some from the state and a proportion from local government. So when we look at these figures, we're not going to have to stump up 193 million, but it's the federals and the state and us a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, I've got my chance. I might just put a point of view that with the questions are correct in who pays and what are the amounts that each council have to pay. The GRFMA have established a small working group to look at a funding advocacy program. We met yesterday and three of the key things were a process for councils and the GRFMA to understand and accept what might be a funding matrix between the councils based on the model, what might be a matrix of funding between state, federal and local and indeed any other stakeholders that might contribute, and then what's the process from after the business plan. Who manages that and how does it actually contribute further on? Because once the business plan is completed, there'll be at least 5 to 10 years work in implementing this process.
It is worth pointing out that the assumptions in our cost and economic assessment is that a dam wouldn't be built for at least 10 years. So our economic analysis has included an escalation of these costs over the next 10 years and then a discounting of it back to present value when we did the economic assessment. The other point I'll make is that 193 million is the very much upper ultra conservative cost estimate at this point in time. It has a lot of contingency in it. It's what we call a P90, so it has a lot of contingency. At the moment, the cost estimates are ranging between 140 million and 190 million for the dam construction. So there's a bit of difference there. And the more work we do, the more accurate that gets.
I might go to Councillor Hennessy.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Catherine, I can understand the dam would take 10 years, but something like an awareness campaign, would you envisage starting that sooner than later? And I say that with my background in emergency management and the fact that I was quite vocal at the big mapping workshop, that I think that's the biggest deficit that exists at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. So the awareness campaign would start from year one. Yep. The reason we forecast the dam construction to be at sort of the year 10 mark is because you need to go through a process of detailed design and permits and approvals and that sort of thing. So we assume that that's a process that would take 10 years. The awareness campaign, we could start, next season. We've done the thinking with SES. We're starting to sort of develop some of the materials. We've done the community survey, so absolutely it could start straight away. And the upgrading of existing levee banks is almost already underway too in some regards because we've started that short-term project and we can chip away at that as funding becomes available. So both of those are assumed to start from year one in our analysis. I'll note that the stormwater management plan, and we've heard reference to stormwater management throughout this evening as well, the stormwater management plan and the business case are being developed side by side. They have different purposes, particularly in regards to accessing different funds of money, but also in the regard that stormwater management has a broader ambit than what a business case for flood management does. So the stormwater management plan will do flood management, but also stormwater quality, reuse, amenity, and so on. So David is leading a project team through the GRFMA to continue to finalise that stormwater management plan throughout this year and into early next year. We are making sure, David and I, that the two are heading in the same direction so they're not divergent on their recommendations for flood. Can I get the next slide? Thanks. So what's next for the business case? We do need to complete a little bit more work on the functional detail for the dam option. We want to finalise our options assessment by updating and getting all of the cost estimates peer reviewed so that we can be really sure they're as accurate as possible. A figure of $200 million is not exactly a number we want to get wrong. We do want to consult with some of our non-government stakeholders that we've worked with through the process so far, so some of the big developers, the horticultural industry, and some of the landholders who might be directly impacted by some of the mitigation options. And then we do want to work with councils, the GRFMA and the federal government on what a proposed funding model and delivery strategy might look like. And that forms, I guess, the back end of the business case and then helps us to make a comprehensive decision on what our final recommendation would be. The next big milestone that we need to, I believe, keep our eyes on is that ISA have us on the books to do an independent peer review in December of the business case, so we're heading towards that. And the Australian Government's round 2 of disaster ready funding is coming up, likely to open in January 2024. So we really want to have the business case independently reviewed before we start submitting for funding into next financial year. And if I can get the next slide, I think that's the last one. There are a few risks that we've been monitoring risks throughout the project, but there's a couple of risks and opportunities that are worth keeping an eye on. Making sure that whatever we propose as a recommended option has support from various stakeholders. We want to look seriously at what the risks are related to a funding and delivery model. So if something is just out of reach because it's too expensive, then we might need to consider what's the most affordable, most impactful option. There are risks related to the planning policies not getting implemented to the full extent as we have modelled them. So the impact of planning controls may not be as great as we've estimated. And we are currently assessing the dam consequence category. So what happens if the dam fails? We don't believe that consequence category is going to go up. And as I said before, round 2 of the disaster ready funding is likely to open in January. So that's our next big milestone to think about, maybe an awareness campaign and seeking funding for that. And I believe that's my last slide, although my clicker's still not working.
Any questions, Councillor Davies?
So just around the awareness campaign, I'm just wondering if you've sort of got a breakdown of, I guess, not just things to do when the emergency hits, but things that they can start doing now. Because I feel like that's the more useful part of it, because in 15 years or whatever, if it suddenly hits, people might not remember their emergency stuff. But if they have, for example, digitised their documents and all this other sort of stuff to keep, their stuff safe, that's what you can do now. And I think that would be a valuable part of the campaign.
Absolutely. So the campaign, basically the $720,000 a year pays for a person to go out and facilitate workshops with people, show them how to prepare their homes. It includes some money for advertising. So advertising and media is not cheap, but think things like they do for bushfire awareness. So heading into the bushfire season, they remind everybody that it's bushfire season. Now's the time to cut your grasses and clean your gutters and make sure you know what to do on a severe and catastrophic bushfire day. The same would happen to flood. So heading into the wet season, you do a media campaign to remind people that wet weather's coming, and are you prepared for flood? Do you have your key documents in a dry bag? Do you know where your key evacuation route is if waters start to rise? One of the things that the SES promote is flood planning. So every household has a bushfire ready plan if they're in a bushfire zone. But if you're in a flood prone zone, do you have a flood plan? Do you know what your evacuation route is? Do you know where to get your warnings, who issues them, when, etc.? So we'd do all of that. And we'd work with the Bureau of Meteorology to get more information out about the warning system as well. So we've just upgraded the network, as Neil mentioned earlier. So let's make sure people know where to get the information and the warnings from that network. so that it'll all be part of it.
Councillor Samble.
Catherine, in all that you've said, very interesting and informing, there's going to be a northeastern link road across to the Sturt Highway, and so much talk has been done about the fact that it will go across the top of the Eastic Dam, and you're talking about raising it to 10 metres. Has there been any discussion with the Department of Transport and other government bodies to be able to link these two things in together, you know, because they all look like they're going to happen and they need to happen. Has there been any discussions on that at all?
Yes, is the answer to your question. But to elaborate on that, yes, I've been working closely with Department of Transport, but we also had a private engineering company do an options assessment for us. They looked at dam design and road design and what it would take at a very high conceptual level, what it would take to put a road on top of the Bruce Eastic Dam once expanded. It isn't a recommended option, the reason being that once the dam is raised 10 metres, it actually becomes very wide, almost 1,000 metres from the tip of one abutment to the tip of the other, which would make for a very, very long road bridge on top of the dam and a very, very expensive road crossing from that new development area out to the main highway. The recommendation of our dam designers was to look at putting it downstream of the dam. Now, that's not to say that if they were on the same timeline trajectory that you couldn't deliver those two projects concurrently and save some money on contractor mobilisation and contract management, etc. But in terms of building them on top of each other, it's not recommended. Transport also have some concerns about grade separation, turning circles and the like in quite a restricted area downstream of the dam. So they're still working through options on the best place to put that connecting road.
Thank you, Catherine. Yep.
And the other one, Catherine, to do with the actual central of the river itself. There's been a lot of discussions over the years about the point of clearing that riverway of debris and trees that have banked up and all these sort of things. And after the recent fire we had, there was a lot of that. There was a bit done, but there was some people that did whatever these helicopter things are down the river, taking photos of it, and picked out 5 spots where the river is actually blocked to the point that if there was a flood tonight, it would flood out and break away as it goes down the river. Has there been a lot of work or thought done on making sure that the riverway itself is completely clear so the water can run straight through and down to the sea?
Yes. In places where we've been able to access the river, we've been addressing that as part of our short-term projects. So the Hillier Fireground project that was mentioned earlier is one of those. Obviously, that was a little bit easier for us to work on, being that it's Town of Gawler land, and we worked collaboratively with your staff to deliver that project. There were several, I think it was in the order of 30 dead and fallen trees after that bushfire that were a flood debris risk that were removed from the site. And it's now also been had quite a lot of weed control. So after the bushfire, you might appreciate that a lot of weeds grew back and sort of blocked the channel as well. So council have been keeping on top of weed control on that site. One of our other short-term projects around the levee banks is also done on the properties where we've had private landholders invite us onto their properties. We've done a full weed survey to see where there are channel blockages. Principally, it's from weeds growing in the channel quite densely. And we are out there at the moment working with a weed contractor to remove some of those from the levee banks and the river channel. You might appreciate that it's a really big job. So going into the future, we do want to continue to work with the landscape boards and the councils and the private landholders to keep on top of that issue. And where there are instances, I guess, of what you'd call like a beaver dam, so a tree might fall over and debris kind of blocks up behind it, that is really, I guess, it's a bit of a complex area in terms of river management, but certainly the landscape boards and landholders need to be, I guess, keeping on top of some of those issues as they arise. But certainly catchment management has to be part of the overall flood management strategy.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Catherine, and Neil and David for your comments as well. I think we'll wrap this up. Thank you for coming along, council members and staff. What we're going to be doing our southern rural areas next. However, the people who have come in, I'd ask you to go out. We're going to open up the back and have a bit more space for you to sit in. So if you can pop out into the corridor, we're going to open up the back and spread those chairs out so you've got more room to move. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.